Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Nora. I'm a part of the programming team at the Princeton Public Library. We're very pleased to bring you this behind-the-scenes presentation on the research and materials for the Princeton and Women's Suffrage digital exhibition currently available from the Historical Society of Princeton. Tonight's program will be recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the live portion. Thank you very much again for joining us. As ever, we are thrilled to be partnering with the Historical Society to bring you some virtual programming. Both the library and Historical Society continue to provide programming and services during this virtual time. Please visit princetonlibrary.org or princetonhistory.org for more information. Tonight, you'll be hearing from the Historical Society's curator, Stephanie Schwartz, and a little later, we will bring in the executive director, Izzy Kasdan. Once we get started, I will be turning off the chat feature for the main presentation, but at the bottom of the screen, you will see an option for Q&A, and we ask that you please add questions at any point during the presentation, and we will address those at the end. You'll also find a link to the digital exhibit, which we hope that you will check out following the presentation. Finally, we also recently had a talk with Anne Gordon, a historian, on memory and the women suffragists of New Jersey. I will be putting the link to the on-demand file for that in the chat toward the end of the program. And again, we hope that you will also check that out. So now let me bring up Stephanie and we will get our presentation started. Hello, Stephanie.
All right. My name is Stephanie Schwartz, and I'm the curator of collections and research at the Historical Society of Princeton. I'm delighted to speak to all of you today about our new exhibition, Princeton and Women's Suffrage, The Greatest Question of the Day, which we developed to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This digital exhibition is accessible on both our website and the library's website, and there is a button at the bottom of your screen that will take you straight there. During this talk, I will tell you about the story of the suffrage movement in Princeton, share tidbits about our research process, and reveal some special anecdotes that did not make the exhibition's final cut. 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was certified, officially making it constitutional for women in the US to vote. But the amendment's passage was never certain. It was very difficult to bring communities, even families, to consensus on the issue of a woman's right to vote. This was especially true in Princeton, which was both deeply divided on the question and closely watched by the entire nation, because it was the home to the sitting president and a former first lady. To understand how the story played out in Princeton, we scoured local, state, and national newspaper records, examined the archival records of women's organizations, and consulted secondary sources about the suffrage movement. Once we were able to identify the key Princeton players, we then took deeper dives researching those individuals. What institutions and organizations were they involved in locally? How did they connect via society or family to other local suffragists or anti-suffragists? This process helped us understand the networks of anti-suffrage and pro-suffrage relationships, which in Princeton were deeply entangled with one another. We also learned that in Princeton, the major suffrage debate happened not in 1920, but in 1915. So we begin our story then. The women's suffrage battle had already become one of the longest fights for democratic and civil rights in the nation's history. In 1915, the national leaders of the suffrage movement were focused less on passing the federal constitutional amendment and more on convincing individual states to amend their own state constitutions to allow women to vote. In 1915, New Jersey was set to lead off a series of women's suffrage referendum elections in 4 eastern states that were the most antagonistic to the idea: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. Suffragists viewed these states, the most populous in the nation, as a major junction in their state-by-state battle for voting rights and as a critical measure of public sentiment on the matter. In the lead up to the 1915 referendum vote, the town of Princeton, at best ambivalent to women's suffrage until that year, became a locus for intense engagement with the suffrage question. Alice Gauss, a suffragist from Princeton, wrote in the Princeton Press in April that year, "Many of the people of Princeton, those who are opposed to suffrage quite as well as those who are not, realize that the time has come not for idle talking, but for serious and intelligent discussion. The battle has been raging in other parts of the country, and we have taken but a lukewarm interest. We have heard arguments one day and forgotten them the next. They have made excellent entreatments at our dinners, but have in no way disturbed our comfortable indifference. But that indifference was coming to an end." In the spring of 1915, several townspeople formed the Princeton Suffrage Committee as a foil to the Princeton branch of the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which had formed a year earlier. Both organizations spearheaded aggressive campaigns to educate male voters. Both sides held mass meetings in Alexander Hall on the Princeton University campus, hosting speakers of national and international importance on the suffrage question. Both suffragists and anti-suffragists penned letters to the editors in local, regional, and national publications, signing with their Princeton addresses. Anti-suffragists hosted fundraising balls. Suffragists canvassed door to door and shouted speeches in the streets. Before introducing our major characters in this story, I do want to share a focus of our research. In writing, married women of this period often referred to themselves and were referred to by others using their husbands' names, like Mrs. John Smith. When researching this exhibition, we worked hard to track down the given names of these women. To find this information, we used marriage announcements, newspaper obituaries, and grave inscriptions as sources. We wanted these women who passionately advocated for a cause to be identified as independent individuals. So who were these women and men? The anti-suffrage cause was the earliest and most dominant view to take hold in Princeton, which was home to anti-suffrage heavyweights. Frances Folsom Cleveland Preston, the remarried widow of former President Grover Cleveland, was one of the most high-profile women of her day. She is regarded by scholars as the first celebrity first lady, her youth and beauty garnering considerable media attention when she married President Cleveland in the White House. She moved to Princeton with President Cleveland after his final term as president in 1897. President Cleveland died in 1908. Frances stayed in Princeton until her death in 1947, marrying archaeology professor Thomas J. Preston Jr. in 1913. She offered deeply influential support for the anti-suffrage cause. She was the vice president of the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage from its formation in 1912 and became the founding president of the Princeton branch when it was formed in 1914. News outlets nationwide covered her appointment to these positions. Colonel William Libby, a Princeton University professor of physical geography, was the founding president of the New Jersey Men's Anti-Suffrage League, formed in 1914. As only men would be eligible to vote on the 1915 referendum, this organization was particularly important. Other prominent local suffragists included Princeton University deans Henry B. Fine and William Francis McGee, as well as McGee's sister Henrietta Oakley McGee. Pro-suffrage sentiment had, up to this point, not gained much traction in Princeton. With the referendum looming, a group of supporters started to officially organize as the Princeton Suffrage Committee in spring of 1915. As one member wrote in a July 1915 letter to the editor, "Time was when the fingers of one hand were all the adding machine needed to sum up those known to be in favor of the feminine vote. Now the Princeton Suffrage Committee, organized this spring, has a working membership of 70 women, among whom both town and university are well represented." Catherine Warren, pictured here at her home on Library Place, was treasurer of the New Jersey branch of the Congressional Union, a more radical arm of the suffrage movement. Jean Gurney Fine Spar was the chairman of the Princeton Suffrage Committee and represented Princeton at statewide suffrage meetings. Her sister, May Fine, also a member of the Princeton Suffrage Committee, was the college-educated headmistress of Miss Fine's school, today Princeton Day School. Their brother was anti-suffragist Henry B. Fine. Eleanor Beach was the wife of the minister of the First Presbyterian Church and mother of Sylvia Beach, another suffragist and the founder of the famed Shakespeare and Company bookstore and lending library in Paris. The street behind Princeton Public Library is named after her. Bessie Brown Mention, a Black suffragist in Princeton, would later become instrumental in organizing New Jersey's Black women in Republican Party politics. And Jessie Lynch Williams, Princeton University psychology professor and first winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, became a very public supporter of suffrage, penning a national pamphlet, A Common Sense View of Women's Suffrage. Williams had a humorous, sarcastic approach to his arguments, which reveals his earlier history as one of the two founders of the Princeton Triangle Club. In response to a New York Times anti-suffrage editorial, he wrote, "From the able way in which the news of the world is covered in the Times, I should say that your newspaper was well named. After reading the women's suffrage crisis on the editorial page, one is tempted to ask, what Times? Does the writer know what century he's living in?" In their arguments for the cause, Princeton suffragists pointed out the many ways in which women were not equal to men under the law. They argued that, among other injustices, women's suffrage could not remedy how women were denied the right to inherit property, how married women could not independently own property, and how divorced women could not have custody of their children. Pro-suffrage activists, using examples from other states where women had already won the right to vote, also argued that social and moral conditions improved in states where women were eligible to vote. Moreover, they argued that women pay taxes, were an increasing presence in the workforce, and deserved by democratic right to be represented in their governments. As the Princeton Press summarized right before the referendum vote, the question of admitting women to share in the government remains a question of simple justice to half the population whose lives and whose interests are affected quite as much by the laws as are the lives and interests of men. We know of no logical argument against permitting women to vote, which does not apply with equal force against permitting men to vote. Conversely, Princeton's anti-suffragists espoused the separate spheres influence argument. In the natural order, women and men had different capabilities and belonged in different domestic and public spheres, respectively. They also argued that women did not want or need the vote because their husbands represented them at the ballot box. Anti-suffragist women in Princeton and nationally certainly were not apolitical. There were a number of issues on which they were quite active. However, they advanced social reform issues through their personal connections with politicians. To them, this indirect influence was a more respectable, nonpartisan option for women. But suffragists argued that it was an avenue for action that was open to a privileged few. It is also important to remember that in this period across the nation, as American demographics rapidly changed and anxiety about this increased, there were strong sentiments in general against any expansion of voting rights. Those opposed to women's suffrage often were also generally opposed to the expansion of the franchise to more men as well. In the South, this disenfranchisement was focused on Black men, in the North, on immigrant men. As Frances Folsom Cleveland Preston wrote in an anti-suffrage column in the Princeton Press, "What greater drawback is there today to the accomplishment of the will expressed at the polls of the intelligent, well-meaning men of our land than the vote of the undesirable men? What greater hindrance is there to the work of good women in their efforts for their country than the vote of the undesirable men?" There wasn't concern that women's suffrage would create a precedent for a general loosening of voting rights, which was worrying to some. Finally, many anti-suffrage activists saw politics as unsavory and polling places, especially unsavory places for, quote, respectable women. In profiles of anti-suffrage leaders, the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage wrote that they were striving to help women by keeping them clean from politics. Indeed, polling places were often in taverns and other perceived masculine places. As part of the 1915 referendum, to counteract the impression and argument that women did not belong at the polls, the New Jersey Women's Political Union, of which Princeton's Catherine Warren was vice president, mobilized thousands of female poll watchers who sat at the polls during the referendum vote, in part to demonstrate that there was no calamitous and improper outcomes to their presence. The campaign by Princeton suffrage organizations were directed at Princeton students as much as the townspeople. At first, it seemed Princeton University, which the campus newspaper, the Daily Princetonian, called the synonym for conservatism during the referendum campaign, would align itself squarely with the anti-suffragists. All the way back in 1867, just 20 years into the suffrage movement, Henry Blackwell, the husband of first-generation suffragist Lucy Stone, organized a meeting in Princeton in support of suffrage for women and Black people. The meeting was reportedly mobbed and broken up by the students. 50 years later, in 1910, students and alumni appeared to encourage the popular stereotype of suffragists as masculine and misguided by portraying their movement as a joke. In 1910, the all-male class of 1900 satirically dressed as suffragists in long white dresses, holding votes for women signs to march in the annual parade during class reunions. A great story that did not make it into the exhibition is how, in 1914, Princeton's famed Whig Cliosophic Debating Society hosted a student debate on the suffrage question. Whig Clio received national attention, so when the antis won, the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association then challenged them to a public debate. Princeton's decline made the front page of the New York Tribune. By the fall of 1915, the feeling towards suffrage on campus had changed. University President John Grier Hibben announced that he would vote in favor of women's suffrage in the referendum, and a poll showed that 56% of faculty members would do the same. The Daily Princetonian published an editorial supporting women's suffrage that October. And in the referendum election, the two voting districts that housed university students were the only ones in Princeton to vote in favor of women's suffrage. One Princeton voter was the subject of intense scrutiny, advocacy, and fascination: first-term President Woodrow Wilson. We were unable to include this in the final exhibition, but the obsession with Wilson's position on suffrage was so intense that in early October 1915, just weeks before the referendum vote, there were reports that forged telegrams with fake signatures of prominent New Jersey men were sent to Wilson to influence him against suffrage. Indeed, President Wilson had avoided the contentious suffrage question up to this point. 2 years earlier, this 1913 political cartoon showed how suffragists, Congress, and economic interests greatly anticipated President Wilson's official position. Also in 1913, a group of suffragists hiked from New York City to Washington, D.C. for a major suffrage parade the day before Wilson's inauguration. On their way, these, quote, hikers stopped at Wilson's house in Princeton to deliver a letter requesting an audience with him on the suffrage issue immediately after he took office. But to their disappointment, Wilson did not commit to one side or another for years. Just under 2 weeks before the special election, President Wilson announced he would support women's suffrage in the New Jersey referendum. In his statement, Wilson clarified that this was his, quote, private conviction as a citizen of New Jersey, and that he remained opposed to the federal amendment, holding fast to his belief that suffrage was a matter that, quote, should be settled by the states. Nevertheless, suffragists viewed this as a tremendous victory that would surely guarantee the referendum's passage. Anti-suffragists, meanwhile, argued that it was too little, too late. When President Wilson, the first president ever to cast a vote for equal suffrage, emerged from his polling place in Princeton, pictured here during a different election, a crowd of suffragists applauded him enthusiastically. Several photographers asked him to pose, but he reportedly refused, saying, quote, "This is too serious a matter to make a spectacle of it." In the end, with voter turnout unexpectedly high, the referendum was defeated in New Jersey by approximately 50,000 votes, a 16% margin. In Princeton, the referendum lost by 14%. The vote in Princeton and Wilson's own ballot was reported in great detail across the nation. But when Wilson continued to withhold support to the federal amendment until 1918, some suffragists soured on the 1915 victory of Wilson's personal yes vote. They considered it calculated, proclaiming on a broadside, "Wilson opposes suffrage in Congress where he has great power. He votes for it in New Jersey where he knows it will fail." Indeed, despite Wilson's support of the pro-suffrage side, the antis had carried his home district, town, and state. Suffragists and journalists the next day searched for a reason why. They blamed Black voters for the defeat, suggesting that they were not informed and were easily swayed by private interests such as the liquor lobby. Articles cited as evidence the, quote, "heavy Negro vote" in several lost Princeton districts, including Wilson's. Prominent Black citizens of Princeton and Trenton challenged this claim. In letters to the editor, they argued that, quote, "the Negro studied the women's suffrage question as did other men," and pointed out that the 50,000 vote margin was greater than the total number of Black voters in the state. They wrote, "One of the largest colored property owners in Princeton and leading men among his race, openly for weeks before the election advocated women's suffrage." Scapegoating Black voters, as one writer called it at the time, revealed the racism embedded in the suffrage movement. Said Frank McNeil in a letter to the editor, "The Negro is not surprised at being accused of crime or the commission of unmanly acts. As paradoxical as it may appear, when a crime is committed in a locality where Negroes reside, it is laid at his door." Though the mainstream suffrage organization sidelined them, Black suffragists and many Black voters recognized Black women's suffrage was a critical tool in their fight for racial justice across the country. The defeat of the referendum in New Jersey was followed by resounding defeats that fall in Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. It was a turning point in the national movement. The national leaders finally abandoned the state-by-state approach, setting their sights instead on the federal amendment. This shifted the movement's center of gravity away from small-town suffrage organizations and towards Washington, D.C. When the federal amendment passed Congress in 1919 and was sent to the states for ratification, the grassroots movement in Princeton resumed, but not with the same fever it had during the 1915 referendum fight. The community was still deeply divided on suffrage. In the state legislature's February 1920 ratification vote, Mercer County State Assembly delegation split its vote. 6 months later, in August 1920, Tennessee became the final state needed to ratify the amendment, and it became law. Despite their lack of agreement on suffrage in Princeton, suffrage advocates and opponents united almost immediately after the amendment passed to ensure that women had the information they needed to vote responsibly. Just 4 days after the 19th Amendment, Claire Culp Oliphant, one of New Jersey's most vocal anti-suffragists, wrote in her For the Woman Voters column, "Until the present time, there have been 3 groups of women: suffragists, anti-suffragists, and the indifferent, uninterested ones. All that is changed. The 19th Amendment is now the supreme law of the land, and every woman should feel that it is her duty to vote and vote intelligently and conscientiously." As an aside, Mrs. Oliphant ended up being a fascinating anti-suffrage to research. In 1915, when there was concern that the New Jersey referendum would be successful, she spearheaded a successful measure to ensure that women, unlike men, would not have to share their exact age when voting. It was dubbed the Oliphant measure, and a newspaper report about its passage concluded with the statement, "What a relief this will be to the women." On September 23, 1920, less than a month after the amendment's certification, 400 Princeton women, more than had ever been directly involved in the movements for or against suffrage, assembled to hear talk about the duties and privileges of citizenship and the methods of voting. Claire Culp-Oliphant delivered the talk at the invitation of Georgiana Gibbs Brown, one of Princeton's strongest pro-suffrage advocates and the wife of the borough mayor. The event's planning committee consisted of a combination of Princeton's pro and anti-suffrage women. Now that women had the right to vote, these former rivals agreed that women needed to take it seriously. And Mercer County's female voters did register and vote immediately when given the opportunity. In the most recent presidential election of 1916, 25,001 voted in Mercer County. That number more than doubled after women's suffrage to 48,318 in 1920. The women's suffrage proponents and opponents of Mercer County did not ultimately turn the tide for women's suffrage in America. But as we have discussed, Princeton garnered much attention. Perhaps more importantly, participation in the movement on any side had a profound impact on women and women's groups in the town. Organizing for and against suffrage taught women how to independently administrate organizations, canvass, and work with other women for a common cause. Catherine Warren, a Princeton suffragist, said in 1912, "The Women's Club is the training school for getting specific things done." In Princeton, these women were instrumental in growing women's clubs, such as the President's Day Club. The leadership of the Present Day Club drew from Princeton suffragists and anti-suffrage luminaries alike. Agnes Miller, a Princeton suffragist and town librarian, and Frances Folsom Cleveland Preston both became involved in a growing anti-war movement among suffrage-associated women for an international body for world peace. Catherine Warren initiated efforts to establish a state college for women, leading to the 1918 creation of Douglass College at Rutgers University. Many of the Black women who had been involved in the suffrage movement used their organizing and advocacy skills to focus on the crisis of lynching in the American South. Nationally, journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett made this her life's work. In Princeton, suffragist Bessie Brown Mention took up this cause. In this March 1922 letter to the editor in the Trenton Evening Times, Mention called upon Black voters to help advance an anti-lynching bill in Congress. The fight to grant women the vote showed that the expansion of freedoms in the United States is never inevitable. Major grassroots efforts of millions of ordinary individuals nationwide fought for and against the cause, and in doing so, they helped to further shape our communities. Thank you. And now my colleague Izzy Kasdan, our executive director, will join me to moderate your questions and help answer them.
Hello, everyone. All right, so feel free to put your questions in the chat. There's an ask a question box at the bottom of the screen. The first question we have is, did Mrs. Cleveland register to vote after women did get the right to vote? Steph, do you want to take that? Or I actually know the answer to that.
Do you know the answer to that one? My guess would be yes, but...
She was a super enthusiastic voter after women got the right to vote, which was very similar to Mrs. Oliphant, where Stephanie gave the story of Mrs. Oliphant, who was a vocal anti-suffrage activist at the state level, like Frances Folsom Cleveland. And then Mrs. Oliphant became basically an educator of voters. And Mrs. Cleveland took that right extraordinarily seriously once it was granted to her. How did the politics around prohibition affect suffrage dynamics? That's the next question.
That's another fascinating one as well that I don't think I came across in my research. I'd have to look.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a big deal in New Jersey because there were a lot of liquor interests in New Jersey. There was a lot of beer brewing happening here, and that came up in the sort of racist assumptions around who had defeated the referendum in New Jersey. There was an assumption that Black voters would side with the liquor lobby because a lot of Black voters worked in the service industry, like in hotels and restaurants where there was service of alcohol. So there was a whole investigation around how influential the liquor lobby had been in the 1915 referendum vote after it failed, that the suffragists conducted. And there was a very, let me see if I can find it. There was sort of an aha moment where there was an article where they were like, we're finally vindicated and we've confirmed that the liquor lobby advocated against suffrage, because the anti-suffragists had always denied that they had been aligned with the liquor lobby. And then in, let's see, there's an article in March of 1916, so 5 or 6 months after the referendum vote. And the headline was, "Brewers gave money to antis, Jersey suffragists now assured of what they long have believed." And so they kind of followed the money and were able to confirm that there was some financial overlap between the anti-suffrage activism and the quote-unquote liquor lobby, though a lot of the individual women who were active in the anti-suffrage cause in Princeton were not necessarily the same women we did check sort of the membership of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the most active prohibition-related organization in the nation and also in Princeton, and there weren't a lot of overlaps in the membership. So it was more of a New Jersey story, that prohibition, anti-suffrage overlap, than it was a Princeton story. All right. Could you say a word about women's disenfranchisement in New Jersey? Could you expand on that a little bit? Do you mean today, or I don't know if the individual who asked that question, I mean, women had been disenfranchised in New Jersey since the beginning of the 19th century. Until the passage of the 19th Amendment. And of course, the 19th Amendment did not give all women the right to vote. In the South, Black women were still denied access to the polls, and Native American women and Asian American women were not given the right to vote until later. Women had the vote in the New Jersey Constitution. Yes, so I encourage you to check out the talk that Nora mentioned at the beginning that is exclusively about the 1776 to 1807, I think. I might be mistaking the end date. That's the story, for those of you who don't know. Women had the right to vote in the original New Jersey State Constitution, and then that right was taken away in the early 19th century. And Professor Ann Gordon speaks about that story in the talk that is linked in the chat now. So we're definitely not expert on that, nor are we able to confirm whether or not any women in Princeton voted during that period, but definitely check out that talk and you'll learn a lot more. And there's also an excellent exhibition, so I hear, that's at the Museum of the American Revolution right now about that story as well.
Yeah, that story's getting a lot of coverage right now, and it's fascinating, but certainly something we didn't get into too much here.
There's another question related to prohibition. I have heard that some bars and pubs elsewhere gave out tickets good for a drink or two if suffrage was defeated. Any evidence found for this here? I didn't see anything about that. Did you, Stephanie?
No, I didn't, but I definitely, that's fascinating. But that didn't, yeah, I don't think I saw anything about that anywhere. I have to look into that a little more.
So I had a question that I wanted to pop in and ask about sort of your research process when you were putting this exhibit together. So obviously you had a lot of newspaper records, and I know you guys have a lot of stuff in your own collection. Were there any tidbits or bits of history that you really had to, like, that you had a lot of trouble tracking down, like information that you knew you wanted, but you had to like look pretty far afield to find it? And if so, where did you find that stuff?
So much of the research for this exhibition came from like really, really digging through newspaper records. We have bound copies of the Princeton Press at our storage, And I spent an afternoon flipping through them page by page and taking photos with my cell phone of articles talking about the suffrage issue in Princeton. And that's how we discovered that there was this weekly column where people would write letters and publish them about their thoughts and back and forth about suffrage, and really get in conversations with other townspeople. So that was really I think the core of the research that we did for this exhibition and this talk was digging through the newspapers, and then having to figure out, then, like we were saying about the names, who actually were these women, because we wouldn't be given their full names. So we kind of have to look further and be like, okay, who actually is this person? What can we find out about her in other avenues?
Yeah, that one super specific thing that I couldn't find so Stephanie and I researched this exhibition together, and I was tasked with going through the Trenton Evening Times, and you'll notice there was quite a bit of information that we pulled from the Trenton Evening Times, which is a digitized publication, which is excellent, especially during this time when we couldn't physically go to archives and conduct this research. And there was a lot of, Princeton was regularly reported in the Trenton Evening Times. The Trenton Evening Times was sort of a regional publication that covered Princeton on a daily basis. But the front page of the Trenton Evening Times from the day after the referendum was missing. And it was so aggravating. That was probably the most important page of any newspaper that we could have looked at. And it just, it wasn't these things happen in archiving, that sometimes a page is missing. So then we kind of had to figure out other ways to understand how the vote broke down, and find other evidence and stories by going and looking at Newark publications, which are digitized by the Library of Congress. And so we were able to find the information we needed about that event, but I really wish that we had the front page of the Trenton Evening Times from that day, because it, I'm sure, would give us even more rich perspective on that moment. And then the one other thing that I kept scouring and trying to confirm, but could never confirm, is there was one, let me see if I can find the quote. One of the stories that we focused on a lot, and that was very fascinating to newspapers at the time, was that in Princeton in particular, you had these family divides within the suffrage movement. So Stephanie touched on the Fines that were Professor Fine was an anti-suffragist, and his sister, Miss Fine was a headmistress of a girls' school and was an ardent pro-suffragist. There was a New York Times article, one of the many following Frances Folsom Cleveland's anti-suffrage career, that talked about, the quote was, Grover Cleveland's widow is president of the Anti-Suffrage Association at Princeton, but his two daughters are ardent workers for votes for women. And that's all it said. And we couldn't find anything more about that. That would have been really interesting to see the Cleveland daughters and whether or not they were active. Obviously, Ruth Cleveland, who was the most famous Cleveland daughter, and it's been debunked, but people think that that's the Baby Ruth candy bar origin. It is not, but she was a national obsession, and she died at a very young age. But there were two other daughters that are lesser known, Esther and Marion. We couldn't find anything about following up on that claim, but it would have been interesting if there was more. So sometimes history leads you to a lot of dead ends.
And then sort of curation wise, obviously I'm thrilled that we could have this talk where you have like all the extra details that you were able to toss in. Were there things that for each of you were the hardest to not include in the digital exhibit? Do you have like favorite things?
I think it was cutting down on the people that we featured who were involved in this movement, because there are just so many local figures, particularly in the 1915 referendum, that we dug into trying to figure out their stories. And we couldn't tell all of them. And some of them were interesting to us, but would not be interesting maybe in the larger context of the exhibition. So we had to focus on the ones that really sparked, and we didn't get to really showcase all the individuals in Princeton who fought on either side of this issue.
I think my favorite story that we weren't able to include was the one about the Whig-Clio debating society, and how the Whig-Clio student debaters, so there were two student groups that debated suffrage, and the antis won, and then the New Jersey state level suffragists challenged these, teenage Princeton students, these grown women, to a public debate to see if they could beat this winning anti-suffrage team. And I just love imagining what that would have been like, even though the students turned them down. So I'm glad that we could include that today, because I thought that was an interesting anecdote. And it also got a lot of coverage. That was in national publications, like West Coast reported that. Just looking at the question box. Were Princeton University professors who were publicly pro or anti-suffrage put under any pressure by the university administration to change their views?
I don't think I saw anything.
There was a rumor that there was pressure that the president of so there was a letter written by a suffragist in Newark, I believe, that accused the university of pressuring pro-suffrage professors, and then the president of the university actually responded in a letter to say that that was not the case. Any other questions? There's a comment in the question and answer box that mentions that the Museum of the American Revolution exhibit about the early women voters in New Jersey was, quote, fabulous. And there's a link to a review, and then also a link to the information about the exhibit. And I do believe that there is going to be some sort of digital companion to that exhibition available online, if it is not available already, for those who are not yet comfortable physically going. Any other questions? Nora, did you have other questions?
There was something that, Stephanie, you said early on that I just wanted to sort of draw attention to. You said the phrase to educate male voters, which I wrote that down because it's so opposite to what you would expect to hear in, sort of the suffrage education. People were always talking about, needing to educate the women, and but the idea of educating male voters around the topic of suffrage was an idea that I really liked. So more a comment than a question.
But it's funny if you think about it, that the women were campaigning for the right to vote, but they did not actually get to vote on their right to vote because they didn't have the right to vote. So it was that was all up to the men, and the women had to find other ways to get their viewpoints out there.
And for the individual that asked about prosecution of university professors that came out publicly on one side or another, I found the quote that I can read. It was in the Newark Evening Star. And it says, in a recent attempt to organize a branch of the Women's Political Union of New Jersey in Princeton, it was rumored that any teacher of Princeton University would be persecuted and discharged if his wife openly advocated or promoted the suffrage movement. Mrs. Abram Van Winkle of this city, being Newark, president of the union, wrote to John G. Hibben, president of the university, for a verification of the statement and received the following reply. My dear Mrs. Van Winkle, I have just received your letter addressed to the members of the Board of Trustees. I wish to assure you most emphatically that the report which has reached you is absolutely false. I cannot imagine how such a report should have gotten to your ears. We have always prided ourselves at Princeton upon our immemorial tradition of tolerance and open-mindedness. Our professors, their wives, and all connected with the university have complete liberty of thought and of the expressions of the same. With assurance of my high regard, believe me, faithfully yours, John Grier Hibben. And of course, then about a year later, Hibben comes out publicly in favor of women's suffrage. So it wasn't really persecution of university professors, but their wives. Did Alice Paul get involved in New Jersey or Princeton during the election fight? Not that we're aware, Alice Paul was an advocate of the federal amendment. So she was focused, her organization was focused on Washington, D.C., and really was not an advocate of the state by state approach that other suffragists, that this whole referendum was a part of. Alice Paul was very one-track minded on the constitutional amendment, which in the end was what was successful.
Yeah, but in all the coverage of the local Princeton movement, I don't believe Alice Paul was mentioned once.
Even though she's a New Jersey native,
Yeah.
You'd think that she would have been maybe spoken once even about the New Jersey referendum, but it was not her preferred approach. And then there's a comment about actual print pages from the October 15th, 1915. So yes, I think on the topic of missing newspapers from the date of the referendum, those would be interesting to see. There's another question: were there in the few years after any acts or other legislation to try effectively nullify the passage? Do you mean, so the 1915 amendment failed, it did not pass. Do you mean the passage of the 19th Amendment itself? If you could clarify. If you're asking about the 19th Amendment itself, I didn't come across anything like that. Did you, Stephanie?
I did not. And I would think that, at least from the women, they sort of picked up the mantle and were like, okay, now if we didn't want the right to vote, now that we have it, we saw that they used it. So, but I don't know about the men.
There were attempts after the 1915 referendum failed. There were attempts by pro-suffragists to try to get around it another way. I believe there was precedent in New York State where New York passed the state level suffrage or got more votes for it when they ran it again in a consecutive immediately afterward. And so there were some pro-suffrage activists in New Jersey that wanted another shot. They also worked on trying to get just focusing on just local election. They tried to slice it a number of different ways after they failed, but they had a couple of allies in the New Jersey state legislature that worked on that, but that it didn't really go anywhere. There was an assemblyman who was going to introduce a bill that would allow women to vote just in presidential elections. For 1916, it was a presidential election year, but he apparently decided against it. So there were some smaller attempts, but nothing at the level of the referendum fight in 1915.
I think that's the end of our questions at the moment. If anybody has any more, please pop them in right now. But as a little bit of a wrap up, again, the Princeton Historical Society of Princeton please access their website at princetonhistory.org. Any upcoming events you'd like to plug while we're here?
Sure. We've got the anniversary of the Battle of Princeton is coming up. So on January 4th, we'll be having a lecture with Larry Kidder, who has spoken with us before. He's a prolific author and researcher on the Revolutionary period in New Jersey, and he just recently published a book focusing exclusively on Princeton in the Revolutionary period. So he will be speaking on that research. It should be very interesting. You can register for that on our website. And then we have our next collaborative program at the public library is our historical fiction book group, which is coming up on January 7th. And that involves, I'll be reading When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka, which is about Japanese-American internment during World War II. And then a scholar on that history from the Pacific War Memory Center at at a University of California institution will be virtually joining us. That's the glories of this virtual time, as we can bring in experts and scholars from all over the country to help us discuss that novel. So registration for that is also available on our website. Looks like there's one more question or comment. New Jersey Constitution required that we wait 5 years before another try. New York did not have that rule. That's referencing some desire to try again for the referendum because it was successful to try again in New York after it failed in New York in 1915 as well. But New Jersey, it was not as simple in New Jersey. And of course, 5 years after 1915 was the fall of 1920, when suffrage had already passed at the federal level.
Well, thank you both so much for presenting tonight. This has been a really excellent presentation. I'm thrilled we also had a lot of great questions from the audience. So thank you again for putting together first the exhibition and then following up with us with this talk. Again, I hope that everyone will take a look at the exhibition. It's linked right below. And I will put, again, the link to the talk with Anne Gordon, which is definitely worth your time. That was a really excellent presentation as well. Please do continue to join in on the library programming, princetonlibrary.org. Tomorrow evening, we have Steve Kornacki and Ingrid Reed following up on the election. That should be a great presentation. So please visit our website for more details on that. And again, we look forward to seeing you at all of our upcoming programming. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening.